The first sign that humanity was losing the war came not with explosions or screams, but with silence. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss stood on the bridge of the Resolute, watching her tactical displays flicker and die one by one. The quantum processors that had guided human fleets for 3 generations simply stopped processing. No warning, no error messages, just darkness spreading across her screens like ink in water. "Comms are down," her XO reported, his voice tight. "Targeting systems offline. Navigation, everything's gone." Through the viewport, Voss could see the rest of the battle group drifting, their running lights dimming as power systems failed. And beyond them, sleek and terrible, the Kra'thek armada advanced. Their ships moved with predatory grace, silver needles against the black, utterly unaffected by whatever had murdered humanity's technology. The Kra'thek had arrived 6 months ago with no warning, no diplomacy, no demands. They simply began dismantling human colonies, extracting resources, and moving on. Humanity threw everything at them: railguns, plasma cannons, fusion warheads, swarms of AI-guided drones. Nothing worked. The aliens' defensive screens absorbed kinetic strikes. Their countermeasures spoofed missiles. Their hacking protocols turned humanity's smartest weapons into flying scrap. Now they had done something worse. They had turned off the lights. "Emergency power," Voss ordered. "Get me manual control of thrusters. We're not dying here." But they would die. Without computers, the Resolute was just a metal coffin. Without targeting systems, her railguns were useless. Without communications, the fleet couldn't coordinate. The Kra'thek had spent months learning how humans fought, studying every algorithm, every protocol, every line of code. Now they had injected something into the networks. A virus, a signal, something, and humanity's technological superiority had become its greatest weakness. The aliens opened fire. Voss watched, helpless, as energy beams carved through 3 destroyers. No evasion, no countermeasures, just death. "All hands abandon ship," she said quietly. "Use the emergency pods. Manual release only." As the crew scrambled for the escape pods, Voss remained on the bridge. She was a commander. She would be the last to leave. Through the failing life support, she heard the dull thuds of pod ejections. At least some would survive. At least some would make it back to Earth to report what happened here. The Kra'thek beam cut through the Resolute's engine section, and the ship lurched. Voss grabbed the command chair as artificial gravity failed. Around her, unsecured equipment floated in the sudden weightlessness. Emergency lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. In the darkness, she could hear the hull groaning, metal stressed beyond its limits. She had minutes, maybe less. Her hand found the manual release for her own escape pod. But as she pulled herself toward the corridor, something made her stop. On the wall, behind a shattered display panel, she saw it. A faded poster from the ship's commissioning ceremony 20 years ago. It showed the Resolute under construction, and below it, a motto in old-fashioned block letters: "Built by hand, fought by heart." Built by hand. The thought stuck with her as she pulled herself into the escape pod and sealed the hatch. As the pod's chemical rockets fired, no computers needed, just combustion and inertia. She looked back at the dying battle group. Billions of lines of code, quantum processors capable of trillions of calculations per second, AI systems that could predict enemy movements with frightening accuracy. All of it useless. All of it turned against them. But before computers, humans had fought wars. Before AI, they had won battles. With paper maps and radio signals, with smoke signals and semaphore flags, with nothing but ingenuity and determination. The Kra'thek had defeated humanity's machines. They hadn't met humanity yet. As Voss's pod tumbled toward the nearest colony world, she made a decision. If she survived this, she would find the people who still remembered how to fight without computers. The old soldiers. The ones who learned tactics from books, not simulations. The ones who could navigate by stars and communicate with hand signals. The machines had gone silent. It was time for humans to get loud. General James Hawthorne was 73 years old, and according to every military regulation in existence, he should have been growing tomatoes in his retirement home, not standing in the ruins of Earth's strategic command. But regulations didn't matter much anymore. Not after the Kra'thek turned humanity's computer networks into expensive paperweights. General, ma'am, incoming shuttle, called Private Rodriguez from the manual observation post. The kid was maybe 20, holding a pair of old binoculars like they were alien artifacts. To him, they probably were. Voss climbed down from the jury-rigged communications platform, basically a radio tower they'd assembled from salvaged parts, and watched the shuttle descend. Chemical thrusters only. No fly-by-wire systems. The pilot had to actually fly the thing. 3 shuttles had crashed this week alone, their pilots trained entirely on computer-assisted systems suddenly having to remember how their great-grandparents had done it. This one made it down. The pilot was shaking when they emerged, but alive. Voss stepped out of the shuttle's passenger compartment, her uniform still scorched from the Resolute's destruction. She'd been traveling for 2 weeks, hitching rides on any vessel still operating, following rumors of a man who shouldn't exist, a general who still taught predigital warfare tactics. Hawthorne stood waiting, tall despite his years, his gray hair military short, his eyes sharp. He wore an old field uniform, the kind without integrated computers or smart fabric. Behind him, the command center looked like a museum exploded. Paper maps covered every wall. Physical compasses sat on tables next to slide rules and plotting boards. Young soldiers hunched over charts, drawing lines with actual pencils. "Lieutenant Commander Voss," Hawthorne said. "I read your report. Hell of a thing watching your entire fleet die because the enemy pressed delete." "Sir," Voss saluted. "I'm told you're rebuilding our forces. Without computers." "Rebuilding implies we had something left to build on," Hawthorne replied. "What I'm doing is archaeology. Teaching these kids how their ancestors fought before we got too clever for our own good." He led her into the command center. Inside, the organized chaos became apparent. This wasn't just nostalgic role-playing. This was serious military operations, conducted with tools most people hadn't seen outside of museums. "After first contact, I told Command we were too dependent on technology," Hawthorne said, pointing to a large paper map of the solar system. "They called me paranoid, told me to retire. I said no." He smiled grimly. "Turns out insubordination is less of an issue when the entire chain of command is dead." On the map, red markers indicated Kra'thek positions. Blue markers showed remaining human outposts. There were a lot more red than blue. "We've got maybe 40,000 combat-ready soldiers across all colonies," Hawthorne continued. "Another 100,000 militia if we're generous with the term. The Kra'thek have been taking their time, systematically harvesting resources from our outer colonies. They know we can't coordinate, can't mount an effective defense. So we're finished," Voss said quietly. "We're finished fighting their kind of war," Hawthorne corrected. "But wars aren't won by technology, Commander. They're won by will, by adaptability, by making the enemy fight on your terms instead of theirs. The Kra'thek study us, predict us, counter us. They're perfect opponents for a digital military." He pulled out a thick book, an actual printed book, and slapped it on the table. The title was faded, Combined Arms Warfare, Lessons from the 20th Century. But they've never faced an analog military. They've never fought an enemy that coordinates with runners and radio instead of quantum entanglement. They've never dealt with tactics pulled from books instead of databases. He flipped the book open to a marked page. Sun Tzu, Napoleon, Patton, Rommel, these men won wars without a single computer. We're going to learn how they did it. Voss stared at the book, then at the map, then at the young soldiers painstakingly plotting trajectories by hand. Seemed insane, primitive, like bringing swords to a gunfight. But hadn't the Kra'thek already proven that guns didn't work? "I need commanders who've seen them fight," Hawthorne said. "You watched the Resolute die. You saw how they operate. That experience is worth more than any computer simulation." He met her eyes. "I'm putting together a force to take back Outpost Orion. It's a mining station on Europa, valuable resources, limited garrison. If we can retake it using old-school tactics, prove that humans can still fight without computers, maybe we can turn this war around." "Orion is deep in Kra'thek territory," Voss said. We'd be surrounded. That's where you're wrong, Commander. Hawthorne smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd just drawn an inside straight. In space, there is no territory. There's just positions, and positions can be retaken. Will you help me teach these kids how to fight a real war? Voss looked at the map, at the red markers, at the impossible odds. Then she nodded. When do we start? 3 months of training turned soft-palmed computer operators into soldiers who could read topographic maps, calculate firing solutions with slide rules, and communicate in semaphore. It turned Lieutenant Commander Voss into something else entirely. A teacher, a drill sergeant, and a true believer in the insanity of fighting a high-tech war with low-tech weapons. The assault force was small by historical standards, 800 soldiers, 12 retrofitted cargo ships, and enough old-fashioned determination to storm hell itself. They'd stripped out all the computer systems, replaced automated controls with manual ones, and loaded up on weapons that didn't need targeting computers. Chemical propellant rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and good old-fashioned explosives. Remember, Hawthorne addressed the troops before departure. The Kra'thek have studied digital human military doctrine for months. They know how we coordinate, how we think, how we fight, or how we used to. They've never seen World War II tactics in space. That's our advantage. Now, as Voss floated in the cramped cargo bay of the Defiant, a retrofitted hauler that smelled like machine oil and fear, she reviewed her paper orders one more time. Phase 1. Infiltration using ballistic trajectories. No powered approaches, no electronic signatures. Just cold metal drifting on calculated paths. 5 minutes to deployment. The pilot called back. No intercom, just shouting through an open bulkhead. Voss secured her helmet, a basic pressure suit, no heads-up display, and checked her rifle. 60 rounds, spring-loaded magazine, completely mechanical. She'd trained for weeks with this thing, relearning marksmanship without computer assistance. The first few days, she'd missed more targets than she hit. Now she could put rounds on target at 200 meters in 0G. The cargo bay doors opened to vacuum and starlight. Europa hung below, its icy surface gleaming. Somewhere on that frozen moon, Outpost Orion squatted on the ice, its automated mining equipment still functioning under Kra'thek control. Go, go, go! Voss kicked off using a handheld thruster pack, manual control, squeeze for thrust, to align herself with the designated landing zone. Around her, 800 soldiers did the same, spreading out in a dispersal pattern they'd practiced 100 times. No formation flying, no coordinated approach. Just individual soldiers following memorized trajectories, making tiny corrections with hand thrusters. The Kra'thek didn't detect them. How could they? The aliens were scanning for electronic signatures, power emissions, communications traffic. They found none. Just 800 small objects drifting in the natural debris field around Europa, indistinguishable from ice chunks and space junk. Voss's boots touched ice 20 minutes later. She'd landed 3 kilometers from Orion, close enough for the mission, far enough to avoid detection. Around her, soldiers landed silently, gathering in pre-planned squad formations marked by nothing more than colored chemical lights that wouldn't show up on enemy sensors. Sergeant Williams found her, tapped her helmet, no radio, no comms, and pointed at his map. Voss pulled out her own laminated map and compared. They were in the right position. Phase 2 could begin. They moved across Europa's ice on foot, or rather in bounding low-gravity hops, covering ground quickly while staying low. No vehicles, no powered transports. Just boots and determination. The Kra'thek garrison wouldn't be expecting an assault force that traveled like this. Slowly, silently, using techniques from before space travel existed. Orion came into view 2 hours later. The outpost was a cluster of modular buildings connected by pressurized tunnels, surrounding a central mining shaft that descended 2 kilometers into Europa's ice crust. Valuable minerals, rare isotopes, resources the Kra'thek wanted. More importantly, it was a symbol, a human installation they'd taken easily, expecting no resistance. Through her binoculars, actual glass lenses, no electronics, Voss counted sentries. 8 visible Kra'thek soldiers in their characteristic environmental suits, moving with that liquid grace that made them so dangerous in close combat. But they were patrolling predictable routes, checking electronic sensors, secure in their technological superiority. She tapped Williams's shoulder and pointed to the west approach. He nodded, gathered his squad, and disappeared across the ice. The assault plan was elegant in its simplicity, pulled from a book about island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific theater of World War II. Multiple squad-sized units would approach from different directions using terrain, ice ridges, equipment sheds, parked mining vehicles for cover. No coordination beyond synchronized watches, mechanical wind-up watches. When the second hand hit 12, they'd attack simultaneously. Voss checked her watch. 3 minutes. She positioned her squad behind a frozen methane outcropping, rifles ready. The plan was to capture the outpost, not destroy it. They needed those facilities. But if the Kra'thek resisted, this would get bloody. 2 minutes. Across the ice, she could see other squads in position. Little flickers of movement, quickly stilled. These kids had learned fast. 1 minute. Voss's heart hammered. This was it. The first real test of Hawthorne's insane plan. If this failed, if the Kra'thek superiority was too great even without their technological advantage, then humanity was finished. 30 seconds. She raised her fist, the hand signal for ready. Around her, 8 soldiers tensed. 12 o'clock. Voss surged forward, rifle up, and 800 soldiers did the same. The Kra'thek sentries turned, alien surprise evident in their body language. Nothing approaching from space, no electronic signatures. Where did these humans come from? But they were already too late. Chemical projectiles tore through alien environmental suits. Not elegant, not high-tech, just lead and copper doing what they'd done for centuries. The sentries dropped, their advanced shields useless against solid slugs fired from mechanical weapons their sensors couldn't predict. Voss reached the first airlock and slapped a shaped charge on it. Another old-fashioned tool, clay and electronics-free detonators. She gestured her squad back, triggered the charge with a pull cord, and the airlock blew inward. Pressure vented, atmosphere howled out, and through the gap, Voss and her soldiers poured in, weapons ready, fighting room to room with tactics that predated spaceflight by 100 years. The Kra'thek fought back. They were fast, skilled, dangerous, but they'd prepared for digital warfare, not brutal close-quarters combat. Not soldiers who coordinated with hand signals and shouted orders. Not enemies who used suppressing fire and flanking maneuvers pulled from 20th century field manuals. The battle for Outpost Orion lasted 4 hours. When it was over, 73 human soldiers were dead. But the outpost was theirs. And in orbit, monitoring stations that had expected an easy garrison duty found their communications suddenly cut off by a force they hadn't seen coming. Hawthorne's gamble had worked. The old ways weren't obsolete. They were the future. Victory lasted 3 days. Voss stood in Orion's command center, which now looked like a World War I operations room, paper maps, colored pins marking positions, runners bringing updates from outlying posts. They'd reactivated the mining operations using manual controls and started shipping processed materials to Earth via ballistic launch. No computers, no automation, just human operators and mechanical systems. Felt like progress. Felt like hope. Then the Kra'thek showed them why premature celebration was a mistake. General! A runner burst in, chest heaving. Incoming ships. 30-plus contacts. Approaching from Jovian orbit. Hawthorne, who'd arrived 2 days ago via the same infiltration method, studied the hastily plotted trajectory map. Response time. 6 hours, sir. 6 hours to prepare for an alien armada that had just spent 3 months studying humanity's new tactics. Voss felt cold certainty settle in her gut. The Kra'thek were adaptive. They'd learned from the Orion assault. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. All personnel to defensive positions, Hawthorne ordered. Secure the surface installations, collapse the outer tunnels. If they want this base back, they'll pay for every meter. The preparations were frantic but organized. Soldiers positioned themselves at choke points with clear fields of fire. Engineers collapsed certain tunnels deliberately, funneling potential attackers into kill zones. Medical stations were set up in the deepest, most protected chambers. Everything by the book, a very old book. When the Kra'thek arrived, they didn't make the same mistakes humans had made for generations. They didn't rely on their computers. The first sign was the bombardment. Not precision-guided munitions that could be spoofed or jammed. Just rocks, asteroids, chunks of ice accelerated to brutal velocities and dropped on Orion's position. Kinetic bombardment, one of the oldest siege tactics in the universe, requiring no technology beyond the ability to push things fast enough. The surface installations disintegrated under the assault. Mining equipment, supply depots, solar panels, all shredded by impacts that registered on seismographs across Europa. Soldiers in exposed positions simply ceased to exist, crushed by multi-ton projectiles moving at several kilometers per second. Fall back to subsurface positions. Hawthorne's voice cut through the chaos. Seal all surface access points. They retreated into the tunnels as the bombardment continued. Europa's surface was being reshaped, craters appearing where buildings had stood moments before. And through it all, Voss realized with creeping horror that the Kra'thek had adapted. They'd learned. Humans discovered low-tech tactics worked. Fine. The Kra'thek would use even simpler methods. Throw rocks. Wait, the humans couldn't leave, couldn't call for help without computers. The outpost was now a tomb. They're besieging us, Voss said, staring at the tunnel ceiling as another impact shook the ice. Medieval siege tactics. They're going to starve us out. Supplies? Hawthorne asked calmly, though his jaw was tight. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we ration. Reinforcements. Can't reach us through that bombardment. And even if they could, we have no way to coordinate with Earth. The Kra'thek will see any incoming ships long before they arrive. Hawthorne studied the map, his expression unreadable. Around them, soldiers waited, looking to their general for answers, for hope, for anything. Sir, Voss said quietly, maybe we should consider. No surrender. Hawthorne cut her off. Never. The Kra'thek don't take prisoners, Commander. You know that. She did. The aliens didn't negotiate, didn't capture, didn't show mercy. They processed everything, including defeated enemies, into raw materials. Surrender meant death, but slower. So they sat in their tunnel fortress, listening to rocks fall from the sky, and waited for General Hawthorne to pull another miracle from his ancient playbook. They didn't know he already had. Gentlemen, Hawthorne said, gathering his senior officers in the deepest chamber of Orion's tunnel complex. We're going to do something the Kra'thek won't expect. We're going to lose. Voss stared at him. Sir, not actually lose, Hawthorne clarified, spreading a map across the makeshift table. An old mining cart turned sideways. But we're going to make them think they've won. More importantly, we're going to make them think they've learned our strategy. He pulled out a book, another ancient text, this one titled The Art of Deception, Military Camouflage and Misdirection. What the Kra'thek understand is patterns, Hawthorne continued. They're brilliant at analyzing tactics, adapting to new situations. They saw us take Orion with low-tech infiltration, so they countered with even simpler tactics, rocks from space. Beautiful, really. Elegant. I wouldn't call it elegant, sir, Williams muttered, rubbing a bruise from a near-miss collapse. But it shows they're learning, Hawthorne said. And that's exploitable. Because if they think they know how we operate, we can feed them false information. Make them prepare for tactics we never intend to use. Voss began to understand. You want to use Orion as bait. I want to use Orion as a teacher, Hawthorne corrected. We're going to attempt to break the siege in exactly the way they'd expect us to. A relief force coming in on ballistic trajectories trying to infiltrate like we did before. The Kra'thek will detect them, destroy them, and congratulate themselves on learning our playbook. Except the relief force will be decoys. Empty cargo containers fitted with chemical thrusters, programmed, mechanically with clockwork timers, to fire at specific intervals. They'll look like troop transports on approach. The Kra'thek will waste time and resources destroying them. While the real attack comes from where? Voss asked. Hawthorne's smile was predatory. Earth. He tapped the map. Not Europa, not Jupiter, but the homeworld itself. The Kra'thek have been systematically harvesting our outer colonies, moving inward. They think Earth is next on the menu, heavily defended, lots of resources, the prize. What they don't know is that we've been preparing something special. While they've been studying our tactical adaptations, we've been building a fleet. A fleet? Williams's eyes widened. Sir, we lost our entire navy. We lost our modern navy, Hawthorne interrupted. Ships dependent on computers, quantum processors, AI targeting. But for the last 2 months, we've been pulling mothballed vessels out of storage. Ships from before the digital age. Retrofitted submarines from the ocean floor. Chemical rocket spacecraft from museum displays. Even some old fusion drive prototypes that were abandoned 50 years ago because they were too primitive. He pulled out photographs, actual printed photographs, showing shipyards full of patchwork vessels that looked like they belonged in a history museum. We've got maybe 60 operational ships, Hawthorne said. None of them impressive by modern standards. But every single one is computer-free, manually operated, and capable of fighting without electronic coordination. And the Kra'thek have no idea they exist because they've been scanning for electronic signatures we're not emitting. Voss felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time in weeks. So while they're besieging Orion and destroying our decoys, we hit their main staging area in Earth orbit, Hawthorne finished. Hard, fast, with tactics they've never encountered. Pearl Harbor in reverse. They'll be caught with their fleet dispersed, focused on outer colonies, unprepared for an attack from what they think is a defeated enemy. But we're still trapped here, Williams pointed out. How does a victory at Earth help us? Because the Kra'thek will have to respond, Hawthorne said. They'll pull forces back from Europa, from Mars, from everywhere. They'll consolidate to protect their staging ground. And in that moment of confusion, Orion becomes a sideshow. Unimportant. They'll either abandon the siege or leave a skeleton garrison. Which will break through, Voss said. Which you'll break through, Hawthorne corrected. I'm leaving on the last outbound shuttle tonight. Someone needs to coordinate the Earth offensive, and I need commanders I trust here to hold Orion until the siege breaks. The meeting lasted 2 more hours, hammering out details, contingencies, backup plans for backup plans. When it ended, Voss walked Hawthorne to the underground shuttle bay, a natural ice cave they'd expanded and pressurized. Sir, she said quietly, if this doesn't work, then humanity dies, Hawthorne said bluntly. But at least we'll die fighting, Commander. At least we'll prove that humans are more than their technology. That's worth something. Is it enough? Hawthorne paused at the shuttle hatch. I've fought in a lot of wars, Commander. Some we won because we had better weapons. Some we won because we had better technology. But the ones that mattered, the ones that defined us as a species, those we won because we refused to quit. Because when every advantage was stripped away, when the enemy should have crushed us, we found another way. He smiled. The Kra'thek are about to learn what that means. The shuttle launched silently, using cold gas thrusters to slip away from Europa while the Kra'thek bombardment continued. Voss watched it go on a periscope display, actual mirrors and lenses, no electronics, and then turned back to her troops. 3 weeks until supplies ran out. 3 weeks to hold this frozen hole in the ice against an enemy that had conquered half the solar system. But 3 weeks was enough. It had to be, because somewhere between here and Earth, General Hawthorne was about to start the largest analog military operation in human history. No computers, no AI, no quantum coordination. Just steel, fire, and the accumulated wisdom of every war humanity had ever fought. The Kra'thek had learned human tactics. They were about to get a history lesson. And history, Voss thought grimly, had a way of repeating itself, especially when the teacher refused to forget the old ways. The Kra'thek attacked Orion's tunnels on day 17 of the siege. Voss had known it was coming. The bombardment had stopped 6 hours earlier, an eerie silence that felt more threatening than the constant impacts. Sensors were useless, radar was useless, but human intuition and experience weren't. Something had changed in the aliens' pattern. They were coming. All positions, stand ready, she called, her voice echoing through the tunnels. No radios, no intercoms. Just shouting like soldiers in trenches a century and a half ago. They'll try to breach near the main shaft. Williams, reinforce Section 3. Patterson, get your people ready for close quarters. The first indication of breach was a sound, a high-pitched whine of cutting equipment. The Kra'thek were boring through the ice, circumventing the sealed entrances. Smart. Expected. Planned for. Hold fire until you see them, Voss ordered. Make every shot count. The tunnel wall exploded inward. Ice and metal sprayed across the corridor, and through the gap Kra'thek soldiers poured in. 8 of them, sleek in their environmental suits, weapons raised. They met a wall of lead. 40 soldiers, positioned in reinforced firing positions, opened up with mechanical rifles. The noise in the confined space was deafening. A thunder of chemical propellants and ricocheting rounds. 2 Kra'thek dropped immediately. 3 more fell back, seeking cover that didn't exist in the pre-sighted kill zone. But they adapted. Of course they adapted. The remaining aliens spread out, moving with inhuman speed, using their dead comrades for cover, returning fire with energy weapons that made human rifles look primitive. A soldier next to Voss took a shot to the chest and went down, armor melted through. Grenades! Voss shouted, pulling an old fragmentation grenade from her belt. Spring-loaded pin, chemical fuse. She threw it down the tunnel, and 3 other soldiers did the same. The explosions were confined, brutal, effective. When the smoke cleared, the breach was silent. Patch that hole, Voss ordered. They'll try again. This is just probing. They did try again. And again. And again. For 2 days, the Kra'thek sent assault teams into the tunnels, each one probing defenses, testing responses, learning. And each time, they adapted. They came in larger numbers. They used suppressing fire. They employed tactics that looked disturbingly like human infantry doctrine. They were learning from the defenders in real time, and they were learning fast. By day 19, Orion's defenders were exhausted. Ammunition was running low despite careful rationing. Casualties mounted 63 dead, over 100 wounded. The Kra'thek could afford to trade losses for information. Humans couldn't. Voss sat in the command chamber, staring at her map with red-rimmed eyes. The defensive perimeter had contracted 3 times. They held maybe 40% of the original tunnel complex now. Another few days, maybe a week if they were lucky, and they'd be compressed into the deepest chambers with nowhere left to retreat. Commander, Williams said quietly, we could try to evacuate. A few shuttles, some might make it. No one makes it through that blockade, Voss said. You know that. We hold until Hawthorne breaks the siege, or we die here. Those are the options. Williams nodded slowly. He'd known the answer. They all did. But Voss couldn't help wondering, was Hawthorne even alive? Had Operation Decoy Earth worked? Or had it failed spectacularly? They had no communication, no way to know. For all she knew, Earth had already fallen, and they were the last humans left fighting. She pushed the thought away. Morale. Leaders couldn't afford despair. Get some rest, she told Williams. I'll take first watch. They're due for another probe in 4 hours. He left, and Voss was alone with her maps and her doubts. Hold the line. Keep fighting. Trust the plan. It was all they had left. The siege broke on day 21. Not with triumph, but with confusion. Voss was sleeping badly when Williams shook her awake. Commander! The bombardment. It stopped. All of it. She was on her feet instantly, grabbing her rifle, expecting another assault. But when she reached the observation post, a periscope extending to the surface through a narrow shaft, she saw something impossible. The Kra'thek fleet was gone. Not destroyed. Not retreating. Just gone. Pulled away from Europa like someone had called them home. What happened? Patterson asked, crowding in with a dozen other soldiers, all trying to see through the single periscope. Earth, Voss breathed. It has to be. Hawthorne did it. They didn't know how right she was until a week later, when the first human shuttle arrived at Orion. Manually piloted naturally, carrying supplies, reinforcements, and news. General Hawthorne was dead. Killed in the opening assault on the Kra'thek staging area when his flagship took a direct hit. But his plan had worked. The analog fleet, using tactics the aliens couldn't predict or counter, had shattered the Kra'thek's Earth orbit presence. Not destroyed them, humanity didn't have the strength for that, but hurt them badly enough that they'd pulled back from all forward positions to regroup. The Kra'thek were still out there. The war wasn't over, but it wasn't lost either. Standing in the reconstructed command center, Voss looked at the maps, the mechanical equipment, the soldiers who'd learned to fight like their ancestors. Hawthorne had been right. Wars weren't won by technology. They were won by adaptability, by will, by refusing to quit when logic said you should. The Kra'thek were brilliant, advanced, powerful, but they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed that stripping away humanity's technology would strip away humanity's ability to fight. They'd forgotten that before computers, before algorithms, before any of it, humans had conquered a planet by being stubborn, creative, and absolutely unwilling to surrender. Voss picked up a pencil, an actual wooden pencil, and began plotting defensive positions on a paper map. Old tools for a new war. The machines had gone silent, but humanity had learned to speak the old language again. And it turned out that language was universal, the language of survival, adaptation, and refusing to accept defeat. Outside, Europa's ice reflected starlight. Somewhere out there, the Kra'thek were regrouping, learning, preparing their next move. They would come again. They were too powerful, too advanced to simply give up. But next time, they would face an enemy they'd never encountered before. Humans who fought like their ancestors, who coordinated with paper and voice, who won battles with ingenuity instead of processing power. Voss smiled grimly and continued drawing her plans. The old weapons weren't obsolete. They were just getting started.